Alright, to start you need your fabric, a t-shirt, and then we're using a lining for this, ribbing, and we have a French curve, a zipper, and again we are going to be making this whole jacket on a Singer sewing machine, and this is a heavy duty model. The link for all this will be in the description below, so check that out. You're going to want to start by cutting your t-shirt and making the pattern, and I recommend using a t-shirt with side seams. It makes it a little bit easier in the end. So you just want to cut down those seams and right out through the arm, and then cut off your armholes, cut up through the shoulder line, and then cut around the neck. I recommend cutting out the neckline, and then that gives it a little bit more accurate of a curve. Also, when you're cutting out this pattern, just make sure you get as close to the seam as you can. So in the end you want 3 panels. Your front panel, your back panel, and your sleeve. And the main reason you want your front and back panel because the necklines are going to be a little bit different. So we are using a large for this, and I found out that using a bigger size, it'll actually shrink down to about a medium. So in the end, this jacket turned out to about a medium. So now we're gonna take our front panel and we're gonna fold it in half and trace it right on the fold. It makes for a more exact pattern on both sides when you unfold it. As you can see, we put our neckline up just a little bit from where it was because we don't want it to dip too far down towards the chest. And then we're using a French curve. It just makes for a little bit more accurate pattern in the end, a little more straight. But feel free just to trace the pattern if you're just going for it because it's gonna turn out fine. Alright, so once you have your pattern fully traced, just go ahead and cut it out. Now you're going to want to unfold your front panel and then just mark the middle because this is where you're going to put the zipper. So just mark the middle. Usually the fold is the center, so you can go off of that and cut right down the middle, and then you're going to have 2 front panels. Moving on to cutting out the back panel, it's going to be the same thing as the front. We did the same exact thing, kind of touched up the curves and went ahead and cut it out. And now we're gonna go ahead and put a back shoulder blade seam in, and we're doing it about a little bit mid on the armholes and just cut straight across, and this adds just a little bit more of a contour fit around your shoulder blades. Then moving on to the arms, we're gonna wanna make the arms a little bit bigger than what the pattern is, just because we're using a non-stretch fabric. And then you're gonna wanna mark from your shoulder down to your wrist. With the ruler and see how far you want your arms to go. And then from there, you're gonna measure around your wrist and make it a little bit bigger. We're going about 10 inches around, and then you're gonna wanna connect your endpoints to where your endpoints are on your arm. So where you measured down, just connect those points and you should have your arms good to go. And then again, go ahead and cut that out.
You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
So now we're gonna make a pocket, and we're just doing an 8x8 pocket, and these are square pockets, super simple to do, and I recommend them. They're super convenient, simple, and they make for a nice look. So go ahead and cut out 2 8x8 squares, and then you're gonna wanna take your lining and do the same thing. Now grab one of each piece, and then you're gonna wanna put right sides together and then sew around in a square, but leave a small little opening so you can pull the right sides out. And once you're done trimming around the outsides and the corners, pull the right sides out and make sure you get those corners and really poke those out so it makes for a nice square pocket. Then go ahead and we're gonna do an edge top stitching on this and just stitch around that whole edge all the way around in a square. And this will help seal off that hole as well. Now just pin that pocket near the bottom or wherever you want. It doesn't matter. If you're doing a pocket in a different area, pin it wherever you want, get crazy. And then just stitch around the sides and the bottom and you're good to go. And make sure you do a nice stitching on both the tops and the corners so that way that pocket is nice and secured onto your fabric. And when you're going to use it, it doesn't rip off. So we went ahead and installed some rivets on here, and we used a grommet press. This grommet press will be available in the description. We're not going to show how to do this. You can do it if you want. It's just a little step, adds for a nice little touch. So now take your back panel and then just sew the top and the bottom together. And now we're gonna add a top stitch on here. It just makes for a nice look in the end and a little more security. And this is super simple. Just fold that back seam to whatever side you're top stitching and sew right along it. And if you have an edge stitch presser foot, I highly recommend using that. We don't have one for the domestic machine right now, but yeah, feel free to just go free like we are without that presser foot. But yeah, definitely look into buying those presser feet if you're gonna do this a lot. So now we're gonna trace out the lining, and I recommend doing this after you get done with your front and back panels, because that way it's more of an accurate fit. Because if you went ahead and just traced the same t-shirt one, it might not be perfectly the same, and you wanna get these about the same so that way they fit together nice and neat in the end.
What we're gonna do right here is go back. 1, 2, 3, 4.
And just like your outer fabric, go ahead, trace it, cut it. And for the back panel, you're not gonna wanna do that shoulder blade seam. It just makes for a more comfy fit in the end. So moving on to sewing the outer fabric together, put your right sides together and start by sewing just the shoulder blades. And once you have those shoulders sewn together, go ahead and add a top stitch, and this will add for more support again on the shoulders because there's a lot of stress in this area. And now from here, after you do those top stitchings, you're gonna wanna add your arms on. Make sure it's the right size. You might have to recut out your arms sometimes, but we go ahead and we start at the middle and we sew to each outside. You can start at the end, it doesn't matter, it's up to you. We just start at the middle because it just, in the end, it's going to be more accurate. And again, once you get done sewing that arm on, you're gonna wanna do a top stitching around that armhole. So now we're gonna sew up the side seam, and we're again starting at the middle, right at the armpit, and sewing out. So go ahead and sew out from the armpit on both sides. And then once you get done sewing that side seam, you're gonna wanna do a top stitch just on the bottom portion. You can totally go all the way up through the arm if you want. We just do the bottom portion, it's a little bit easier to get to. Sometimes the arm is hard to do a top stitching on, but feel free to if you want. So now it's time to sew the lining together, and this is done pretty much the same way. We're gonna start by sewing the shoulders on, and then don't do a top stitching on this. You don't need to top stitch any of the lining, just keep it nice and flat. Once the shoulders are sewn, go ahead and sew on your arms. And just like before in the outer fabric, go ahead and sew that side seam from the armpit and out. And do this process for both sides, and then your lining is done. And now we're gonna measure the neckline and the bottom line, and this is so we can get a more accurate cut on our ribbing. Just how it sounds, go ahead and measure around that neckline. And when you go and cut your ribbing, you're gonna wanna go a little bit shorter because you'll wanna stretch that ribbing to the exact size. So when you're cutting the neckline, just make sure you round it off at the end, and one side's flat and then it goes up to round. And you can see that in the video, and that will just make it taper off towards the ends when it nears the zipper on the neckline. Also remember, you're gonna be folding these over, so make sure you cut them twice the size of what you want it to appear in the end.
Good evening, everybody.
I just found the keys to a city. The beats are big and the lights are pretty. So why can't we get to the busy where the dreams are in the sky? You got me high on wonders and why. You got me high, I think I might die. I'm face to face with a mirror I've never faced.
Now we're adding a little bit of the outer facing fabric onto the neckline, and this adds for a better look when it's being wrapped around the body. And make sure it's the same width, and then just however long you want to do it, it's totally up to you and whatever look you're going for. I mean, you can make this as long as you want or as short as you want. It's just nice to have it in there when you're adding on your zipper, so that way you're not taking your zipper and attaching it right to ribbing for your jacket. Sometimes that looks a little bit cheap, so definitely add this in. You can go as long as you want, but just make sure it's the same width as your ribbing. Once you have those cut, put the right sides together and sew that directly onto your ribbing. And then once you have both of those sewn, go ahead, flip it over and do a top stitch. Now take that, put the right sides together, and just sew right up the side seam. Then go ahead and flip it right side out and do a top edge stitch. So go ahead and grab your neckline, and we're gonna sew along the edge as close as possible, and this will just keep it in place and make it easier to install when you're sewing it onto your garment. So now take your outer shell, turn that inside out, and then take your lining and put the right side of the lining with the right side of the outer shell and put it into place.
You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Do a little check, make sure everything lines up nice and accurate. If you have to do a little trimming on the lining, it's not a big deal. Sometimes you have to do that. It's really not a big deal. Go ahead and trim it up and just make sure it all fits accurately together. And now you're gonna take that neckline and put the nice side, the folded side, down inside in between those two layers. You wanna sandwich it in and then definitely pin this into place so that way it doesn't keep flying out of there. It just makes it way easier to sew. And I recommend pinning each side first and stretching it and then put a pin in the middle. This helps it so it's evenly stretched across the entire neckline and it has a nice pull. And then pulling that neckline so that way everything pulls out nice and flat. Sew along as close as you can towards the edge. Definitely take your time on this part. Takes a little work lining all those fabrics up and working through it. Take your time, go slow, and it'll be a lot nicer in the end.
That's an interesting twist.
And then as you can see, once you pull right sides out, it looks nice. And then go ahead and top stitch around that neckline again, just to secure everything in place and hold it down and add that nice finishing touch. Again, take your time on this part. Make sure all the seams are flat and not bunching over. Now we're going to sew the front openings together, and this is a little bit tricky. It's super easy, but it looks kind of confusing. Just take your fronts and put the right sides together. You don't have to turn it fully inside out. Just take those fronts and turn them right sides together and do a straight stitch all the way down. And once you do both sides, flip the right sides out and do a nice edge stitch all the way down. So now we're gonna go ahead and sew our bottom ribbing on, and it's super simple. Just right sides together and stretch it, pin again on both sides and in the middle, and just sew that together right on.
What we're gonna do right here is go back.
Take your time, go slow, make sure it's nice and even on both openings, and other than that, super simple.
Way back. Way back. Now bring that bass out, man. Now bring that bass out, man. Way back. Way back.
So once you have that sewn on nice and even, again with the top stitch, go ahead and do that, and this kind of flattens out that bunching and makes it look 1,000 times better. So this is just a little quick tip. Since we're only doing this on a domestic sewing machine and not using a serger or anything to cover up those raw edges, this is a bias tape kit, and the link is in the description below. This will help cover up that raw edge if you're going for a nice clean look. You totally don't have to do this. We're not gonna do it for the video, and would definitely this is recommended to do before you top stitch it. So if you're gonna go this route, make sure you do this before you top stitch.
Tomorrow, go for a drive. Go for a drive. Tomorrow, go for a drive. Go for a drive. Tomorrow, go for a drive. Go for a drive. Tomorrow, go for a drive.
And go slow, make sure all the fabric is nice and flat, work your way to the end. This will help it from bunching over on itself and just making it look ugly.
Tomorrow, go for a drive. Go for a drive. Tomorrow, go for a drive. Go for a drive. Tomorrow, for a drive. Go for a drive. Tomorrow, go for a drive. Tomorrow, go for a drive. Go for a drive. Tomorrow, go for a drive.
So now we're gonna go ahead and cut the cuffs for the arms, and this is the same ribbing as the neckline and the bottom. And go ahead and you can literally just whatever width you want it, go ahead and make it that. If you want longer cuffs, make them as long as you want. We're just doing a standard length. And then go ahead and cut 2 of these out. So now take your cuff and put the right sides together and sew along that open side. And you're gonna wanna do this for both cuffs. Then once you have both the cuffs sewn, go ahead and fold it in half and then try it on, see if it fits nice. And if you have to, go back and make adjustments. And from there, you're gonna wanna just sew it right onto your garment, and we'll show that in the next step. And to sew this cuff on, really easy, you're gonna wanna turn your garment inside out and then place that cuff in the middle. You're not gonna wanna sandwich it in between the fabrics, you're gonna put it right in the middle so it's the right side is touching the right side of the outer shell. And sorry, it's kind of hard to see in the video, but you're just gonna wanna keep stretching that cuff along the outer line and work around in a circle. And then turn the right sides out and just double check to make sure everything looks good. And then from there, you're gonna wanna flip it back inside out and do a top stitching around that outside. And then repeat this process for the other arm. So moving on to the zipper, this is actually very easy to do, but very easy to mess up. All you really want to do is make sure that both sides are lined up and it just keeps your jacket even and not just offset. So take your zipper and you're gonna wanna line it up to where it meets at the bottom. Our zipper is actually a little short for this video, but we're closing the bottom off a different way. So put your zipper right up towards the top and put right sides together. So that way the right side of the zipper and the right side of the outer shell are touching, and then go ahead and sew one side on. I highly recommend using a zipper foot or any narrow foot for the sewing machine, and most sewing machines like this one, it came with it. So go ahead and attach that and use that. It will help you out 1000%. So now you're gonna wanna sew the other side on, and we're just gonna line the bottom of the zipper up with where the bottom of the other track ended. And this will just make sure that both panels are symmetrical. So once you get that lined up, go ahead and sew that on. And if it's not totally lined up in the end, it's really easy just to de-thread it, take it off, line it up, try it again. Keep trying until you line it up perfectly. You're gonna wanna do that before you go ahead and top stitch. So after you get this done, zip it up and see what it looks like. And then once you're totally satisfied with how the zipper looks, go ahead and do a top stitch all the way down. And then boom, there you go, your jacket is done. And now again, for the fun part, go ahead and brand this jacket how you want, put patches on it, do whatever you want, get crazy. And this is just a basic outer shell of a bomber jacket, super simple to do. And we just made this out of a t-shirt. So find a t-shirt that fits you and get crazy. And thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment, let us know what you think. And we're gonna keep the videos coming for you guys. See you next time.